He was already gone by the time the alarm started, but I remember exactly where I was the last time I saw him. Alan Craig, hunched over his desk in that windowless corner cubicle, the kind they gave to people whose job they didn't understand, but knew they couldn't fire. Yet. He looked up from his screen once during that last review meeting and said, so flat I nearly missed it, Scenario D is just a matter of time, not if, when. Then he slid the binder forward, thick as a phone book, filled with words no one wanted to read. Of course, Dorian Vale laughed. Our new CFO, all cufflinks and charisma, with that same damn-gelled helmet of hair he probably used as a personality. He tapped the binder like it was a coaster. You know what panic does, Alan? Sells insurance, but not confidence, and we're in the confidence business. Everyone laughed. Everyone except me. Alan didn't argue. He just looked at Dorian like a man watching a dog chew through a power line. I watched too. The moment was quiet, cold, precise. By the way, if you're into stories like this, ones that unravel the whole truth just when you think it's over, do us a favor. Subscribe, give the video a like. 97% of folks forget, and it really keeps this team fired up to keep bringing you more stories that hit like a freight train. All right, back to it. I was the only one who ever took his risk register seriously. Maybe because I used to be in operations before Dorian pushed me over to strategic communications. They love putting women there. Easier to brand than to budget, I guess. But I knew what Alan saw, because I'd helped him trace one of the failures in the drone integration pilot 2 years ago. He didn't just flag risks, he mapped their DNA. And Scenario D, it wasn't theoretical. It was coming. Delvex ran like a machine built by too many people who thought streamlined was just a synonym for cut costs. We touched everything: automated warehouses in Jersey, ship to shore in Hong Kong, predictive routing across the whole damn Atlantic. And all of it, every single lane of it, relied on API vendors stitching systems together like digital duct tape. Alan knew how thin that stitching was. He'd even charted the vendors' financials in one appendix. 3 months cash runway, he muttered once, tapping the cell with a red pen. That's a choke point. But Dorian didn't want choke points. He wanted pretty dashboards and Q2 burn numbers that made the board smile. So he slid Alan's position into the redundancy column, like it was a paperclip we could do without. Effective July 1st, Alan was rolled off. They called it a structural streamlining. He called it early retirement, with the kind of deadpan shrug that made you wonder if he'd already outlived 5 other CFOs. He had. His last act before walking out was to upload the final revision, Q2 Risk Register, Submission 5. Inside it, buried in Appendix F, was a 14-line sequence titled Scenario D, Maritime API Outage and Logistics Cascade. I know, because I helped format it. What I didn't know was that Alan had filed it not just internally, but externally. He'd included a copy in the packet sent to our insurance underwriter per our business continuity documentation protocol. Most people didn't know that clause still existed, especially Dorian, but Alan did. Hell, he probably wrote it into the last policy cycle before they demoted him out of contract reviews. When he left, nobody clapped. There was no party, just a cold cup of black coffee left on the break room table and a blank badge drop in HR. But something about the way he left, calm, untouched, made me nervous. Like he wasn't leaving at all, like he was just waiting, watching. Dorian wasted no time after that. He merged risk under compliance finance and installed some kid named Lance from Deloitte as risk analyst lead. Lance wore loafers without socks, and once told me he thought probabilistic modeling was just a fancy way to play Sudoku. I watched our internal Slack light up with vendor switch notifications. Cost-saving measures, they said. Efficient vendor consolidation, they said. I watched the clock instead. Alan had told me once, offhanded, that every risk has a half-life. You can ignore it for a while. Then it gets loud. I just didn't think it would get loud this fast. Dorian Vale arrived like a storm cloud in Cologne. 3rd week of March, unannounced. Walked into the main office with a consultant in tow and a folder labeled Q2 Trim Plan before half of us even knew we had a new CFO. Sharp suit, Italian leather shoes, a smile that could make a priest nervous. First thing he did was cancel the breakfast bar in the break room. Second was to ask if anyone knew what our average downtime cost per API failure was in raw dollars per hour. When Alan answered calmly, $2.7 million if the failure hits routing before 8 a.m., Dorian blinked like someone had just spoken to him in Morse code. You sure about that? He asked, smirking. Alan didn't even look up. It's in my register. Page 7. That was the first time I saw Dorian chuckle, that condescending little chuckle, the kind men like that use when they're already mentally deleting your job title. These panic lists again, he muttered, waving Alan off like a waitress had offered him tap water instead of Perrier. Nobody reads them, man. They just stress the board out. I've seen it 100 times. You give investors 100 red flags, they start asking for 100 solutions. We don't need risk complexity. We need cost simplicity. Alan stayed quiet, but I could tell it took effort. His hands tightened just slightly on the folder. That meeting was the turning point. Up until then, risk was a quiet corner of Delvex, never flashy, but respected. After Dorian, we were a cost center, a liability, something to be reorganized, and reorganize he did. First came the jargon, zero redundancy targeting, budget realignment pathways, strategic stack simplification, which was code for, if you can't prove you make money, your ass is gone. Departments started feeling it fast. Procurement lost half its analyst pool. Compliance got merged with legal in name only. No change in headcount, just double the work. By April, HR was whispering about Q2 workforce mobility optimization. Everyone knew what that meant. Dorian was circling, and he wasn't looking for lifeboats. He was looking for ballast to toss. Alan tried once more in the next leadership sync to explain the implications of vendor stack drift. We've onboarded 6 new API vendors in Q1, he said, clicking through a chart. None of them fully tested across maritime integrations. One of them just spun off their DevSecOps team entirely, outsourced to Poland. Dorian didn't even look at the slide. I'm not in the weeds with tech, he said, casually checking his watch. I'm here to balance risk with growth. And frankly, these theoretical edge cases, they're not helping us hit runway goals. No investor wants to hear about Polish DevOps. They want to hear about EBITDA expansion. Alan stared at him for a beat. You can't expand EBITDA if your containers don't arrive. It hung there for a moment, like a single loose wire humming in a dark room. Dorian smiled, sharp as a box cutter. Then maybe we stop relying on the idea that everything will break and start investing in what works. That was the end of that. By the next Monday, Alan's department budget was slashed 22%. 2 junior staffers were reassigned. His access to internal vendor dashboards was temporarily suspended pending finance review. The message was clear. The writing was on the wall, and Dorian had the Sharpie. Alan didn't rage, didn't even vent. Just cleaned his whiteboard, removed his server credentials from the compliance sheet, and quietly started finalizing the Q2 risk register, one last time. He handed me a sticky note a few days later, folded twice. What's this? I asked. Scenario D, he said. I opened it. 4 lines of code, a vendor string, a timestamp. Proof, he said simply. I should have asked more, should have pressed. But I'd already seen how Dorian operated. You either got in line or got gone. Alan was neither. He was just watching the gears strip. And Dorian? Dorian was still walking the halls like he'd just invented logistics, slashing ops meetings to 10-minute stand-ups, posting motivational quotes on Slack like we were all interns. Disruption is just strategy in motion, one said. Let the weak parts fall away. Funny thing about weak parts, sometimes they're holding everything else together. It came in a sealed envelope because HR still thought formality made something humane. Effective July 3rd, your role will be dissolved as part of a strategic restructuring initiative. That's how they phrased it. Like Alan's job had quietly wandered off a cliff and no one was to blame. No mention of his tenure, no acknowledgement of the fact that half the crisis protocols in Delvex's system had his initials buried in the footnotes. Just dissolved. Like he was a sugar cube dropped in corporate coffee. He read the letter once, folded it carefully, and tucked it in the same binder he always kept beneath his desk drawer, the one labeled, if this, then that. No yelling, no HR appeal, just a soft nod. Like he'd already expected the cancer to spread, and now it was just a matter of closing the blinds before the chemo started. I found him the next day in the copy room, running off what looked like the entire quarterly risk report on our last remaining printer that hadn't been optimized by finance. 52 pages, full bleed, color-coded. Not the sleek little slide decks Dorian loved, but full frameworks, spanning policy gaps, supply chain escalation maps, vendor failure analysis. And near the back, Appendix F. Scenario D, Maritime API Failure, Cascade Event. He looked up at me over the edge of a toner cartridge and said, "They'll call it fiction until it isn't." There was no bitterness in his voice, just certainty, that cold, clinical certainty he always carried. He wasn't writing to be believed, he was writing for the postmortem. What most people don't know, and Dorian never cared enough to learn, is that Delvex's risk mitigation documentation wasn't just internal fluff. It was tied directly into our business interruption coverage. Every quarter, our insurer required a signed copy of the official risk register, logged and time-stamped as part of our compliance rider. And buried deep in that protocol was a clause Alan himself had pushed through back in 2018. All risk reports must identify named mitigation leads with supporting documentation of role status. So when he finished compiling the Q2 register, he didn't just send it to internal compliance and legal. He sent a clean copy to our underwriter with a cover letter marked Required Addendum, Staffing Update. In it, he highlighted 2 scenarios, A and D. The first was a generic ransomware event. The second, a cascading logistics disruption stemming from third-party API vendor degradation. And next to it, primary mitigation owner, A. Craig. Underneath that, he scribbled a note. Role to be discontinued, July when protocols incomplete. It was a hand grenade, pulled with the pin tucked neatly back into the filing cabinet. The internal copy was archived in the compliance server. The external copy was time-stamped and confirmed via return receipt from the insurer's automation desk at 3:47 p.m. on May 12th. Then Alan packed up his desk. I helped him carry out a single box. No plaques, no photos. Just 2 notebooks, a framed quote, "Plan for failure like it already started," and a backup USB with his name etched in blue tape. He didn't speak on the way to the parking garage, just nodded once, looked back at the building and said, "It's not the mistakes that ruin companies, it's the egos that ignore the warnings." Then he was gone. By end of day, the internal Slack showed access revoked next to his profile. Dorian posted a chirpy announcement, "Excited for this next phase of streamlined synergy." Lance was now listed as acting risk lead. The kids still didn't know where the vendor interlock dashboard even lived. I looked up the return receipt later that night. It sat, unread, in the insurer's portal, waiting, unblinking. A digital landmine with the exact coordinates for where we'd eventually bleed. Alan hadn't fought for his job. He'd built a pressure trigger instead, one that would go off the moment the right scenario collapsed under its own neglected weight. And scenario D, that one didn't need drama, just time. And time was running out. It took less than 3 weeks after Alan's exit for the rot to show. Not the flashy kind of rot, the headline scandal or front-page lawsuit. No, this was quieter. Procedural. The sort of decay you only noticed if you were close enough to smell the wires overheating under the dashboard. First came the reorg memo, with Dorian's usual flair for corporate euphemism. Risk and business continuity would no longer operate as an independent function. For alignment purposes, it would now fall under the purview of strategic compliance finance, which is like saying you're moving the fire marshal under catering. Makes sense on a flowchart. Gets people killed in real life. Alan's team was split. 2 reassigned to audit, 1 to legal review, and the last, poor Kevin, shoved into a desk near the vending machines where his primary task became updating a single spreadsheet Dorian liked to call Risk Pulse. It tracked, I kid you not, the vibe score of key departments based on employee sentiment surveys. Alan once joked that we'd die from a dashboard overdose. Now, it wasn't a joke anymore. Lance, the Deloitte import, was named Interim Risk Lead. His qualifications included a 2-year stint on SOX controls and a podcast about leadership called No Excuses, Just Grind. I watched him stare at Alan's old terminal like it was written in Sanskrit. On his first week, he asked me what a maritime stack dependency meant. I said, "It means if your shipping API sneezes, the port gets pneumonia." He laughed, thought I was kidding. Meanwhile, Dorian went full throttle on vendor consolidation, swapped out 3 API partners in under a month, citing cost variance reduction and contractual agility. 2 of them had no redundancy protocols. One had just laid off half its back-end team and migrated customer support to a chatbot that couldn't distinguish timeout from time card. But the dashboard looked great. Inside ops, you could feel it. System refreshes lagged longer. Container location pings got dropped more often. Customs pre-clearances started bouncing. The ground wasn't shaking, but the walls were breathing wrong. I still had Alan's sticky note in my desk drawer. Out in the world, Alan had already landed on his feet. Started a small consulting outfit. Quiet, tight-knit. I'd see him pop up on LinkedIn every few days, not with selfies or hustle threads. Just small clues. Vendor selection is risk posture in disguise. Redundancy isn't bloat, it's breaks. Little nudges. The kind you ignore if you're insecure. The kind you reread if you've ever watched a machine die from one loose bolt. I sent him a message once. Just a wave emoji. He replied with a gear. He was watching. Not out of spite. Not even out of interest, really. Just like a pilot listening to radio chatter from a plane he used to fly. Hearing the pitch shift. Knowing what comes next. Inside Delvex, it was all smiles. Lance gave a pep talk at all hands about democratizing risk analysis, said we were moving into self-regulated resilience. I leaned over to my seatmate and whispered, "Translation, we fired the experts and are now guessing." She didn't laugh. She just kept staring at her dashboard, blinking slower than usual. Dorian paraded quarterly numbers around like a victory banner. Optimized vendor spend. Contractual wins. Margins up 3.4%. The board clapped. One director even complimented the cleaner stack on a Zoom call, but clean doesn't mean strong, and optimized doesn't mean stable. We'd swapped steel for foil. Everyone just prayed the wind wouldn't blow too hard. Alan's Scenario D wasn't a monster. It wasn't dramatic. It was a drip. One vendor hiccup, one failure at the wrong hour, one botched retry loop. And then the freight would freeze, the ports would clog, the clients would call, and the dashboard would show nothing but blinking red. We weren't there yet. Not quite. But we were close enough that the air smelled like static. And Alan? He didn't say a word. Just posted a photo one morning of a harbor at dawn. Fog creeping in. Caption, visibility low. Vessels should proceed with caution. But Dorian didn't see it. He was too busy polishing the blindfold. It started as a flicker. A ping missed here, a container ID not registering there. Just enough to be annoying, not enough to raise alarms. At first. At 4:12 a.m. EST, the Maritime Tracking API, specifically the one handling synchronized location updates from Pacific-linked port systems, began failing partial calls. At 4:14, retrieves stacked up like a bad poker hand. At 4:19, the vendor status page quietly flipped to investigating, and by 4:27, Delvex's entire real-time container tracking platform flatlined. 6 hours. That's how long it lasted. 6 full hours before the vendor even admitted the outage wasn't just localized. By then, it was already over. Not the outage, the consequences. By 6:45 a.m., our West Coast distribution team was already in chaos. Freight routing algorithms defaulted to outdated maps. Some shipments rerouted to ports that weren't even open. Others stalled at customs checkpoints because the manifest sync failed mid-transmission. By 7:12, thousands of containers sat in limbo across 17 port hubs worldwide, tagged as non-verified, which in freight language means dead in the water. The first client call came at 7:21, a European auto manufacturer. Their specialized battery modules, precision logged for the delivery to Georgia, were now sitting on a barge, redirected to Montreal. At 8:04, a pharmaceutical firm called. Their vaccine shipment, delicate, temperature-controlled, time-sensitive, had cleared Panama but was now stuck at customs in Houston because the API had failed to register its pre-clearance dock. By 8:32, legal had already received 5 breach of SLA notices, each worth at least 6 figures. We didn't need a dashboard anymore. We needed a lifeboat. Inside Delvex HQ, the mood turned ice cold. No yelling, no blaming, just that sterile silence you only hear in operating rooms and war rooms. Dorian walked in wearing his usual tailored smugness, glanced at the ops board, and said, "All right, what's the workaround?" That's when the head of logistics, usually mild as toast, looked up and snapped, "There is no workaround, Dorian. You fired it." I felt that line hit like a blade. Everyone did. Slack channels lit up in real time. Screenshots of delayed shipments, scrambled routing data, missed compliance windows. Ports were starting to log congestion notices. A freight consortium pinged us, asking for clarification on our sync status. Internally, someone pulled up the SLA matrix. Over 40 clients had penalties clauses that triggered if shipment location confirmation failed for more than 2 hours. We were now at hour 3. By the 4th hour, executives from 3 continents were on the line. PR was ghostwriting tweets before the press even caught on. Finance started triaging potential exposure. By hour 5, someone, probably someone new, asked if this would be covered under our business interruption insurance. And that's when I saw Dorian freeze. The room went quiet again. He turned slowly and asked legal to pull the policy. And the last risk register, he added like an afterthought, like he'd finally remembered it existed. Legal came back 20 minutes later, looking like someone had just read the obituaries of 3 friends in a row. Scenario D, they said flatly. It's in there, described almost exactly. Vendor API outage, maritime disruption, chain failure risk. And mitigation? Someone asked. Legal paused. Then, primary mitigation lead listed as Alan Craig, role terminated July 1st. No one spoke after that. Not even Dorian. Outside, containers were stacking up like bricks in a wall we couldn't tear down. Clients were forwarding contract clauses. Insurance reps were dialing in. And the system, the beautiful, brittle system Dorian had optimized down to bone, had finally hit the floor. The question wasn't if we'd recover. It was who we'd have to beg for a paddle when the water hit our chin. And in that moment, all I could think about was a line Alan once said, quiet, almost bored, as he flipped through vendor logs. Systems don't fail because of one mistake. They fail because someone thought the right warning was just noise. The meeting was held in Executive Conference Room A, the one with the frosted glass walls and a table so long it felt like a runway for failed decisions. Legal was already seated when I walked in. Pale and paperless, a bad sign. Dorian sat at the head of the table, tapping his Mont Blanc pen like it could somehow restart time. The CFO of Delvex Systems, man of metrics, destroyer of caution, was sweating through a $4,000 suit. The insurance rep was late by exactly 3 minutes, and somehow that felt tactical. His name was Michael Reddick, senior underwriter for maritime risk and business continuity at Haverly Mutual. Gray suit, tan briefcase, voice like gravel. He opened his folder slowly, without small talk, and laid a thick packet down on the table with all the finality of a judge reaching for a gavel. "I've reviewed the claim," he said, not even looking up. "As you're aware, under Section 12 of your business interruption policy, coverage depends on documented mitigation protocols being both filed and in active execution." Someone from legal nodded too fast. "Correct, and we filed quarterly." Michael held up a hand. Then he flipped to a page in the packet, pulled a yellow sticky tab, and read aloud, "Scenario D, maritime API cascade resulting in systemic logistics disruption across Delvex's Pacific freight corridors." He paused, looked up. No one breathed. "This scenario," he continued, "was logged in your Q2 risk register, dated May 12th. It includes a breakdown of third-party vendor stability metrics, redundancy gaps, and risk impact tiers. I have the full report here." Dorian cleared his throat. Yes, that was submitted. We're aware." Michael didn't blink. He turned the page and tapped a margin note with one finger. In the notes, I found this line, handwritten, "Primary mitigation owner, A. Craig, terminated July 1st. Protocol incomplete, awaiting replacement designation." The silence that followed was not empty. It was charged, like the pause between lightning and thunder. We replaced the function, Dorian said too quickly. That's not... We transitioned risk under compliance. It wasn't like we just abandoned the mitigation. Was the protocol executed? Michael asked, voice flat as slate. Dorian hesitated, looked at Lance, who looked at his shoes, then at Legal, then at me. No, I said. It wasn't. The truth didn't even sting anymore. It just sat in the air like smoke. Michael closed the folder, didn't raise his voice, didn't lean forward. He just stated it like a weather report. Then, you failed to meet the conditions for coverage. Legal inhaled sharply, as if trying to summon an argument from thin oxygen. We believe the risk was theoretical. Michael shook his head. It was documented. It was acknowledged. And your company terminated the designated mitigation owner before implementing a replacement or executing the mitigation strategy. That qualifies as material negligence. He pushed the folder forward. Our recommendation to the carrier is to deny the claim. Dorian looked like he'd been unplugged. His mouth opened once, closed, then opened again. But we're talking hundreds of millions. $612 million and rising, Michael said. We are aware. The board chair, usually a statue, finally spoke. Is there any path to appeal? Michael gave a courteous, pitiful smile. You can try, but the documentation trail is clear. You had the warning, you had the plan, and you removed the person responsible for it. Then he stood. Meeting over. The moment the door clicked shut behind him, panic exploded. Half the board started talking at once. Legal launched into clause interpretation gymnastics. Dorian mumbled something about legacy procedures. Someone asked where the most recent backup logs were. Another wanted to know if we could pin this on a vendor. I didn't say anything. I just stared at the folder, still sitting in the middle of the table, still open to Appendix F, Scenario D. Alan hadn't just predicted the storm. He'd mapped the floodplain and spray-painted the exits. But we'd boarded them shut and fired the guy who drew the map. And now we were neck deep. They called it an emergency session, but it felt more like a funeral, one where the corpse was still twitching. We were ushered into the same boardroom as before, but the mood had shifted from sterile panic to controlled collapse. No catered lunch, no bottled water, just coffee, bitter and burnt, in paper cups, and a stack of printed emails on every chair like a silent indictment. The board chair didn't even bother with pleasantries. He just dropped a question into the center of the room like a live grenade. Who approved the termination of Alan Craig? No one moved. Then Legal spoke. Their voice was measured, but I could hear the strain. We pulled the HR docs, budget approvals, and email trails. The headcount reduction was authorized under Initiative 14B, Risk Realignment. CFO sign-off dated May 3rd. All eyes turned to Dorian. He stared at the table, eyes flicking back and forth like he was reading some invisible script. It was part of a broader initiative. Craig's team had under-leveraged productivity. Don't. The board chair cut him off with a raised hand. This isn't a productivity issue. This is a liability issue. You signed off on the removal of the sole documented mitigation owner for a risk we're now living in. PR handed out a printed memo, their fingers trembling slightly. We have 3 major clients suspending future contracts pending resolution. One of them is demanding the public confirmation of insurance coverage. Another just forwarded their contract termination clause, citing gross operational negligence. Someone cursed under their breath. The head of logistics threw her pen down. This was preventable. Alan didn't just warn us. He handed us the damn playbook. Dorian finally snapped. Oh, come on, this isn't all on me. He buried it in Appendix F. No one reads the footnotes of a 50-page memo. I couldn't help myself. You laughed at the memo. You called it panic fiction. He turned to me, eyes bloodshot. You think I signed off on this alone? We were all under pressure to cut fat. I stood. Alan wasn't fat. He was the firewall. The room went quiet again. Legal cleared their throat. Let's be very clear. The denial of insurance coverage stems directly from a documented failure to maintain mitigation continuity, and the documentation trails lead back to the CFO. There's no plausible deniability. Outside the glass walls, I could see Slack threads exploding. Ops was falling apart. Finance couldn't keep up with vendor breach penalties, and customers were beginning to tag us on social media, asking why refrigerated cargo was still drifting in port with no updates. Internally, IT had spun up a mirror environment just to try and rebuild the freight timeline. I heard one engineer mutter, "It's like watching a plane crash from inside the cockpit, with no windshield." Dorian tried to steady himself, smoothing his tie. "We can fix this. We issue a statement, refocus the narrative, show we're tightening protocol." "No," the board chair said. "You're done talking." Then he looked at PR. "Prepare a statement acknowledging operational oversight. No mention of Craig. We don't want to turn him into a martyr." Too late. I'd already gotten 3 emails that morning, 2 from former colleagues, 1 from a client, each asking the same thing. Was Alan right? I didn't reply, just opened Slack and searched for his name. His profile was still deactivated, but his words weren't. His final report was still pinned to the MAI's Risk Archive channel, still time-stamped, still intact. And as everyone scrambled for spin, for salvage, for cover, I realized something. The man they called Paranoid had documented a prophecy, and now the prophet's name was stamped across every single page of our failure. Irony? Dorian Vale, the man who deleted the panic list, was now writing one of his own, line by line, in real time. From the inside of a fire he lit, it hit the newswire at 9:47 a.m., just 2 lines from Haverly Mutual's public disclosures. Claim Artar Dayak 61845 has been denied. Policy breach, documented mitigation failure, and negligent termination of designated protocol owner. That was it. No adjectives, no spin, just a corporate guillotine drop. By 10:15, Delvex's stock was in free fall. Not a dip, an unzipped vein, from $148 to $88 in 2 hours. Analysts tripped over themselves trying to update risk models in real time. Investor relations went dark. Bloomberg ran the headline. Delvex denied coverage on 600 mm loss. CFO's role under scrutiny. Our inboxes melted. Clients didn't ask questions. They sent termination clauses with timestamps. Some C-size attorneys, others just canceled in silence. Inside the office, panic had calcified into something colder. Survival mode. Legal was gutting policies. PR ghosted. Slack channels turned into obituary walls for dead contracts and unread warnings. One person quietly walked into the stairwell, sat down, and cried into their blazer. No one even tried to pretend anymore. By 1 p.m., the board issued a formal suspension of Dorian Vale. Not even an exit package, just a security escort and a non-disclosure agreement so thick it could have been used as ballast on one of the ships he just lost. I didn't look away when they walked him past my desk. His suit was rumpled, tie loose. The man who once called Alan's 50-page register the most expensive bedtime story in corporate history now looked like he hadn't slept in a week. Funny how that works. He didn't say a word, just stared at the floor like it had betrayed him too. Across the river, Alan must have seen the headlines. His name wasn't in them, but it might as well have been etched across the entire situation in red ink. I imagine he read them with the same quiet focus he gave every vendor clause. No celebration, no "I told you so." Just another confirmation of pattern. I know this because at 2:18 p.m. I saw the email. Subject line, consulting opportunity. Body. Hi, Alan. I hope this finds you well. We're undergoing a reorganization and urgently seeking experienced risk continuity advisors. Would you be open to a brief conversation about helping us rebuild our frameworks? It was from a Delvex exec, one of Dorian's inner circle, the same one who once told Alan, to his face, that risk is just compliance with better graphs. Alan never replied. I called him later that night, not to beg, not even to pitch, just to check in. He didn't answer, but I left a message. You were right. Scenario D wasn't a panic list. It was the table of contents to a future we ignored. They're asking for help. I don't know if they deserve it, but I thought you should know. He never called back. But the next day, I saw a LinkedIn post from him, a photo of a container ship drifting in open water, mist curling around the bow. The caption read, "Not every course correction comes in time. That's why some of us write the map before the fog." No hashtags, no emojis, just that. Cool, clinical, unbothered. Meanwhile, back at Delvex, the risk archive was being scrubbed. Interns were tasked with restructuring what remained of Alan's work into a more digestible format. Lance was nowhere to be found. Someone asked if we had any backups of his original reports. I said no, because if you have to rewrite the warning after the fire's already started, you're not protecting anything. You're just sweeping ash. The final boardroom session was quieter than a morgue. No coffee, no phones, just thick air, the hum of overhead lighting, and the weight of consequences setting like wet cement around everyone's ankles. The insurer's rep, Michael Reddick again, stood at the head of the table. He didn't bother sitting this time, just held the same tan folder in his hand like it was the blade of a guillotine. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize. He just read the line like a weather forecast already rolling through town. "You documented this risk," he said, flicking the folder closed with one thumb, then terminated the only person addressing it. Coverage denied. No rebuttal, no last-minute what-ifs, just silence. One board member, Langford, I think, rubbed his temples and muttered under his breath, "How much did that register cost us to ignore?" No one answered. The folder stayed on the table, sealed now, like the lid of a casket. Legal shifted in their seats, trying to calculate the damage without numbers. PR didn't show. Compliance was still reeling. Finance had gone full bunker mode, and as for the new risk lead, I heard he submitted his resignation before lunch. When the meeting adjourned, no one even stood. They just stayed seated, like the room itself had lost gravity. You could feel it. Regret as a physical weight. Like every paragraph they skimmed, every flag they ignored, had grown arms and now sat in the chairs beside them. Meanwhile, across the river, Alan Craig poured hot water into a chipped blue mug in a home office lined with quiet trophies. A wall of books on failure analysis, a shelf of maritime law texts, and a single printed copy of his last Q2 report, spine-worn and page-tagged. He opened his laptop. On one screen, a dashboard. Not flashy, not branded. Just a clean feed of shipping telemetry from open APIs, an independent tool he'd built himself. Rows of container IDs, color-coded backlogs, choke points in red. On the other screen, an email from another logistics firm asking politely if he'd consider advising their new risk committee. He didn't reply. Outside the window, cargo ships moved like chess pieces through fog. Delayed, redirected, stalled. He took a sip of tea, watched the backlog tick upward, and then, calmly, almost as if narrating a weather change, he spoke, to no one in particular. They called it panic. He glanced once more at the glowing screen. The dashboard blinked. Another red choke point lit up off the Singapore coast. I called it preparation.